In the farthest reaches of the Lapine frontier, beneath the glow of 3 pale suns, lived a man named Ethan Folkheimer. He was known among the spacefaring folk as a relentless mercenary, a soldier of fortune whose exploits across half the known galaxies earned him respect, fear, and, most often, an uneasy mixture of both. Scars marked his tall, lean body from collarbone to wrist, silent testaments to the wars he had fought for causes he barely remembered. In his wake lingered the odor of starship fuel, the tang of laser burn, and the faint sadness of a soul long adrift in cosmic battles that, to him, offered neither solace nor end. Yet on a particular day in that uncharted expanse, Ethan was about to embark on a journey he could never have foreseen. A journey that would bind him inexorably to the fate of a violet-skinned alien woman, one who seemed nothing more than a quiet, frightened slave at first glance, but would soon reveal a destiny that stretched far beyond the dusty corners of the galaxy. A swirl of cosmic dust enveloped the battered starport known as Kendler Station, perched precariously on the edges of the frontier. It was less a station than a drifting mass of metal scraps, hammered together by desperate colonists seeking to eke out a living in the void. Kendler's corridors were cramped and rife with the stench of unwashed bodies, smuggled goods, and petty crimes. And it was here that Ethan found himself waiting for the client who had promised him a fortune, or something akin to it, in exchange for a piece of technology he had risked his life to obtain. Within a dingy chamber that claimed to be a negotiation room, Ethan's gaze swept across rusted walls and flickering lights. He tapped an armored gauntlet on the pitted metal table, a gesture of impatience. He had come bearing a small rectangular device no larger than a child's palm, an artifact rumored to be from the lost Karath civilization, famed for forging technology centuries ahead of its time. Whatever the object truly was, it was valuable enough to have cost Ethan the better part of a year spent dodging warlords, rival mercenaries, and scavengers. The door hissed open. Entering with an air of authority was Gareth Morvith, a man whose name alone conjured images of violence and double dealings. A thick fur cape draped his broad shoulders. His bionic eye glowed a dull red, scanning the room. He walked on boots that clanked menacingly with each step. Behind him came 2 bodyguards, their eyes flitting warily from corner to corner. In the hush that followed, Morvith advanced toward Ethan. "Folkheimer," he greeted, voice like gravel. "You've something for me?" Ethan drew a breath. He was used to dealing with the unscrupulous. "The Karath artifact," he said simply, placing a small box on the table. His gloved hand hovered over it. "Let's be clear. The deal was 20,000 Erodium credits." A predatory grin traced Morvith's lips, revealing gold-capped teeth. "Oh, you've misunderstood me." He flicked a hand at his men, who promptly set down a heavy iron cage behind him, clanging metal rods forming a rough enclosure. "I don't carry that many credits. But I do have something else of equal value." Ethan's scowl deepened. He had heard rumors of Morvith dealing in forbidden trades, drugs, exotic creatures, stolen artifacts, and slaves. "I didn't come here for nonsense," Ethan muttered, brow knitting in suspicion. "Oh, I assure you, this is no nonsense," said Morvith. He stepped to the side and, with a flourish, unlatched the door of the cage. From within its darkness emerged a figure, a woman. Her skin was a faint shade of violet, and even in the grimy lighting of the station, it seemed to glisten with an otherworldly shimmer. Across her face hung raven hair, braided in intricate patterns reminiscent of star lore. Most striking of all were her eyes, silver irises luminous with a quiet, intense light. "This is Lyra," Morvith announced. "She's valuable. More than enough to pay for that scrap of Karath metal, I'd wager." Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. In all his galactic travels, he had encountered countless alien species, but he had never seen a woman quite like her. Perhaps the hue of her skin was reminiscent of some fair insect or the rumored Quillis from the far nebula reaches, but something about her presence seemed regal. He quickly composed himself. "I don't traffic in slaves," he said coldly. Morvith's gaze darted around the room, measuring Ethan's words. "Think of her not as a slave," he said smoothly, though the sneer had not left his face. "Think of her as a living artifact, yours to keep or trade at your leisure." Ethan cast a glance at Lyra, whose eyes lowered as if used to such humiliations. A part of him roared inside. He did not want to be complicit in this. Yet, if he refused the deal, Morvith might slip away with the Kirath artifact. Or worse, he might send his goons after Ethan, forcing a violent standoff in this cramped station. "Let me see your credits," Ethan insisted, making one last attempt to keep the transaction clean. "You'll not see a single credit coin from me," growled Morvith. "But she is real, and she's worth as much as you'd ever hope to gain in these parts. Perhaps more." Ethan's fists clenched. He had fought wars for far less noble reasons. But there was something in the woman's gaze that unsettled him. She didn't look like a cowering captive. There was a steel behind her silver eyes. Her posture, though subdued, betrayed a certain dignity, a quiet command of self. Could it be that Morvith was hiding something? For a few moments, Ethan's mind roiled with scenarios. Perhaps the best course, for now, was to accept, walk away without bloodshed, and figure out what to do with the woman later. "Fine," Ethan said at last, pushing the artifact across the table. He snapped his fingers at Lyra. "Come with me." With careful steps, she emerged from the cage and joined him. Morvith's grin grew. "A pleasure doing business, Folkheimer," he said, lifting the Kirath artifact and cradling it like a coveted gem. "Oh, and do enjoy your new companion." Ethan's glare lingered on the man for a heartbeat before he turned and strode out. Lyra followed in silence. Behind them, the guards sealed the rusted door with a hiss and a clank, leaving behind the faint echo of their mocking laughter. Ethan led Lyra through Kindler Station's labyrinthine corridors, weaving past vendors hawking questionable wares, star-weary travelers, and the occasional brawl that erupted over spilled drinks or perceived slights. Had he not just made a deal with a known criminal, he might have found grim amusement in the day-to-day chaos. But as it was, his mind spun with regret and unanswered questions. When they finally arrived at Pier 12, Ethan's starship awaited, the Storm Wraith. It was a mid-sized craft, battered from years of dogfights, meteor storms, and smuggling runs, but reliable enough to keep him alive. The hull bore scorch marks from laser fire, and sections had been patched with mismatched alloy plates. To Ethan, though, it was a home of sorts, the only permanent fixture in his restless existence. He gestured for Lyra to follow him up the loading ramp. He keyed the hatch open, and they stepped into the main corridor. The vessel's interior was cramped, a living area merging with the cargo bay, a single pilot's cockpit, and two private cabins. One cabin belonged to Ethan, the other typically served as storage. Without ceremony, Ethan spun around to face Lyra. "I don't know who you really are," he said, voice rough, "but I don't hold slaves. Understand?" She lifted her gaze, silver irises shimmering under the overhead lights. "Then why did you accept me as payment?" Her voice was calm, measured, more cultured than Ethan had expected. "I didn't see a better way," he confessed. "If I turned you down, Morvith might have sold you again or killed you. Now that you're here, you're free to do as you please, once we figure out where you can go." He ran a hand through his short, dark hair. "If you need credits, I can give some. If you need passage, I can drop you at a civilized station." The woman did not answer for a moment. Ethan eyed her curiously. Up close, he noticed subtle patterns on her skin, faint silver lines that might have been tattoos or natural markings. She wore a ragged, transparent shawl over a simple tunic. Her posture, though outwardly timid, betrayed a hidden confidence. "My name is Lyra," she said at last, "of the House of Lucier, or what remains of it." She paused and lowered her gaze again. "For now, I owe you my gratitude for sparing me whatever fate Morvith had planned." Ethan nodded, stepping aside so she could move freely about the ship. "There's a spare cabin. It's not much, but you can rest there. I'll plot a course away from Kindler. Somewhere safer." He reached for a metal locker embedded in the wall and rummaged for a spare set of clothes. "You can wear these. They might be baggy, but at least they're clean." She accepted the garments. "Thank you." Ethan found himself studying her again, unsettled by the impression that her presence carried far more weight than the average traveler. House of Lucier, he recognized the name from distant rumors, a line of nobility on the planet Astrian, if memory served. That world had once possessed a proud monarchy, rumored to have been dethroned amidst a civil war. He'd never paid much attention to politics, but the name still tugged at the recesses of his memory. "Go on," Ethan muttered. "Clean up, rest. I'll set our course." Lyra offered a faint nod and disappeared into the adjoining cabin. Ethan stood for a long moment, gazing after her. He recalled the quiet command in her posture, the refined lilt in her voice. House of Lucio? What was a princess, if indeed that was what she was doing in the cage of a scoundrel like Morvith? Shaking off his questions, Ethan made his way to the cockpit. He settled into the pilot's chair and began the takeoff sequence. Engines hummed, and the storm wraith rose, rattling free of Kindler's docking clamps. Through the view screen, the swirling depths of space beckoned. Once the autopilot was engaged, he slumped back and tried to formulate a plan. If Lyra was a fugitive of some kind, that might mean trouble. High-level trouble? He had no intention of risking his neck just to get entangled in royal politics. Still, the faint memory of those silver eyes flickered in his mind, and with it came a disconcerting urge to protect her. He snorted, chiding himself for foolish sentimentality. He was a mercenary, after all. He had made a living by looking out for number one. Sometimes, out of a battered conscience, he would show mercy to innocents caught in crossfire, but a princess? That was an entirely different matter. Pushing aside the swirl of doubts, he flipped a lever to angle them into hyperspace. The console beeped, star lanes aligned, and with a thunderous roar, the ship surged beyond the speed of light. They were off. Far behind lay Kindler Station and the ghostly silhouette of Gareth Morvith. Far ahead, a future uncertain. Despite the tumult of the day, exhaustion weighed on Ethan. He made his way to his cabin and tried to sleep, but his mind whirled with images of the Karath artifact and the unsettling exchange that had landed Lyra in his care. Eventually, hours passed, and he drifted into a fitful rest. He awoke some time later, roused by a soft knock at his door. Instinctively, he reached for the blaster on his bedside table. "Who is it?" he demanded. "It's me, Lyra," came the reply, quiet yet steady. "May I come in?" Rubbing sleep from his eyes, Ethan sat up. Doors open. She entered, wearing the plain clothes he had provided, which draped loosely over her slender frame. Though her posture was polite, there was an unmistakable intensity in her expression. Ethan noticed she had attempted to tidy her braided hair, but exhaustion shadowed her features as well. "I appreciate your hospitality," she began, clasping her hands before her. "But I'd be a liar to say you owe me nothing. You've taken me from Kindler Station. You risk your safety, perhaps." Ethan frowned, swinging his legs over the edge of the bunk. "I told you, I don't keep slaves. I only took you to ensure you could escape that station. Morvith is no friend of mine, but I do have a conscience." His tone softened. "If you want me to leave you at the next port, I will." Lyra shook her head. "I cannot return to any ordinary port. My presence would draw the wrong sort of attention. You see, I'm not just any refugee." A nervous tremor touched her voice, but she steadied herself. "I told you I am of the House of Lucier. Before the civil war on Astrian, my family ruled over a vast dominion, known for its resource wealth and proud traditions. When the revolution came, my parents, the king and queen, were deposed. Many were killed. I escaped only by the bravery of loyal knights who smuggled me off-world. For years, I wandered, seeking asylum, but warlords and criminals recognized my potential ransom value. Eventually, I was sold, traded from one unscrupulous party to another." A flicker of sorrow passed over her face. "Morvith was simply the latest. The rumor is he hoped to sell me back to those who now rule Astrian, or to the highest bidder among the galactic powers. Either way, I was a commodity. A princess in hiding, without a throne." Ethan exhaled. The notion of smuggling a runaway royal, especially one with so many adversaries, sank in him like a heavy weight. "So, you're royalty?" he asked. "And you were a slave?" She nodded once. "Even royalty can fall victim to the cruelty of men." She took a hesitant step forward. "Ethan, if my captors learn of my whereabouts, they will come for me. You have no obligation to involve yourself. If you let me off at some remote station, I can attempt to live in anonymity." Her gaze dropped to the floor. "But I suspect they will never stop searching." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Memories flickered in his mind, faces of those he failed to save in one war or another. He'd been a hired gun so many times, but he'd seen countless innocents caught in the crossfire of powerful factions. And here stood Lyra, the image of nobility under siege. Perhaps he saw in her eyes a reflection of battles he'd fought and lost against oppressive forces. He rubbed at the stubble on his jaw. "Well," he said, voice gruff, "I suppose if we're going to outrun them, we'll need a plan." Surprise lit Lyra's face. You will help me?" He ran a tired hand through his hair. "I don't know if help is the right word, But I didn't bring you on board just to ditch you somewhere you'll be hunted. I'll take you to a place I know on the outer rim, a quiet colony. We can lay low, figure out our next move." Lyra bowed her head graciously. "Thank you." Ethan cleared his throat. He felt a curious stirring in his chest that he tried to ignore. "I'll show you how to use some of the ship's systems. If we run into trouble, we'll need every advantage." Before she could reply, the cockpit comm system chirped. A faint beep signaled an incoming transmission, likely from a passing ship or station. Ethan stood, nodding to Lyra. "Let's see who wants our attention." They moved to the cockpit. Ethan slid into the pilot's chair, pressing a button on the console. Static crackled, then a computerized voice cut in. "Storm Wraith, this is Freya Outpost. We have a flagged cargo request associated with your vessel. Please respond." Ethan exchanged a glance with Lyra, who looked uneasily at the console. "Freya Outpost," he muttered under his breath. "That's a mid-sized trading post near the Helios lane. Could be standard checks, or something else." He keyed the comm. "This is Ethan Folkheimer of the Storm Wraith. We're just passing through. No cargo to declare. What's this about a flagged request?" There was a moment's pause, then the voice again. "Records show your vessel is due to deliver a special consignment on behalf of one Gareth Morvith. Confirmation required." Ethan felt a surge of anger at Morvith's name. So the slimy bastard must have put out a notice to track me. He stabbed the comm switch off and turned to Lyra, who wore a worried frown. "I guess Morvith isn't letting go so easily," Ethan said. "They know about us." Lyra's voice trembled slightly. "Then we must run." He nodded curtly, powering up the engines to push them harder through hyperspace. "Hang tight. We'll alter course. If Morvith has connections on Freya Outpost, we're not stopping there." The console beeped urgently as if the outpost demanded a response, but Ethan ignored it. With a firm shove of the throttle, the Storm Wraith veered, light stretching into streaks around them. He felt a familiar, almost comforting pressure of acceleration. This was the life he knew: danger, pursuit, the endless flight from one conflict to another. But this time was different. He was no longer alone with only his regrets for company. There, beside him, was a princess in exile, relying on his skill, and perhaps his conscience, to keep her safe. For several days, Ethan kept the Storm Wraith in a winding route through lesser-known star lanes, away from major trade routes. Fuel constraints meant they needed to stop eventually, but each time they approached a station or fueling depot, Ethan found it bristling with potential threats. Warlords and battered frigates, bounty hunters scanning vessels, or suspicious outpost authorities checking every hull for contraband. Word seemed to have spread. A rumor circulated among the underworld that a precious cargo was on the loose, an alien woman who might fetch a king's ransom. In the cramped confines of the ship, Ethan and Lyra grew more accustomed to each other's presence. He taught her how to monitor the navigation screens, calibrate the engines, handle emergency protocols. She proved a quick study, often surprising him with questions that revealed an incisive mind. When she wasn't assisting with the ship, she spent her hours in quiet reflection in the spare cabin, occasionally humming a melancholic tune that stirred Ethan's curiosity. One evening, they finally settled in orbit around a small planetoid known as Charon's Rock, a lifeless chunk of, or floating near the outer rim. It had an automated fueling station, no permanent inhabitants or meddlesome authorities. As the ship latched onto the fueling port, Ethan and Lyra gathered in the cockpit to review their supplies. "We've enough rations for a month," Ethan said, scanning a small inventory screen. "Fuel will hold us for a standard cycle if we're careful." Lyra stood near the console, arms folded across her midsection. "And then what?" "We can't drift forever." He exhaled. "I know. Once we're fueled, we might slip further toward the edge, find a colony that's truly off-grid. But that's a gamble. Even in the deepest corners, Morvith's network could find us." She lowered her gaze. "I can't ask you to spend your life running because of me. There must be a way to end this pursuit." He eyed her. "You've any suggestions, princess?" A sad smile brushed her lips. "Back on Astrian, my father once spoke of secret alliances, factions who opposed the new regime that took over. If I could reach them, perhaps they'd grant me sanctuary, or rally behind me to restore the monarchy. But that's no small task. And they might be scattered, forced into hiding." He tapped the console, thoughtfully. "Do you believe they'd still be out there? Loyal to your house after all this time?" "I do not know," Lyra admitted. "But if I remain adrift, I risk being captured again. If there's a chance of restoring Astrian to just rule and ensuring the safety of others who suffer the current regime, then I must try." Ethan nodded. The idea of returning to a war zone unsettled him, but so did the prospect of indefinite flight from bounty hunters. Sometimes, the best defense was to confront a problem head-on. "We should gather intelligence," he said at last. "We'll need safe passage onto Astrian if we want to confirm these alliances. And we'll have to watch for Morvatha's men." She offered a decisive nod. "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." They locked eyes for a moment. In those silver irises, Ethan glimpsed determination, conviction, qualities he had once admired in the rare individuals who truly believed in something greater than themselves. A faint warmth stirred in his chest, though he did his best to remain stoic. "All right," he said. "Let's top off our fuel and chart a course toward Astrian. We'll do it in stages, so we don't draw attention. But I have a feeling this will get dangerous." "I understand," Lyra replied quietly, her voice steady. As they separated to tend to tasks, Ethan to manage fueling, Lyra to stow supplies, neither spoke of the subtle bond forming between them. Their companionship was forged in the crucible of necessity, laced with the unspoken knowledge that if they failed, their fates would be sealed. Ethan would return to the lonely existence of a hunted mercenary, while Lyra would face captivity, or worse. 2 standard weeks passed before the storm wraith reached an unremarkable system known as Araka's Fall. Nestled there was a hidden station called the Port of Whispers, a floating bazaar famed for dealing in rumors, secrets, and illegal goods. If anyone could provide news of Astrian's current state or the location of exiled loyalists, it would be found there. Ethan and Lyra docked in a discreet hangar, paying off the watchful docking official with a few precious Erodium coins to keep their registry off the books. The Port of Whispers sprawled in a labyrinth of corridors, each lined with stalls where shadowy figures sold stolen technology, exotic spices, strange beasts in cages, and star maps of questionable accuracy. Ambient lights flickered in rainbow hues, and an undercurrent of tension hummed in the recycled air. Lyra kept the hood of her cloak pulled low over her face to hide her distinctive features. Ethan walked beside her, rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning for threats. He led her through the winding passageways to a place he knew from prior visits, a small tea house called the Jade Crescent. Its proprietor, an old woman named Relia, had a knack for collecting intel from every traveler passing through. The establishment was dimly lit, filled with the fragrant steam of alien brews. They found Relia behind the counter, half hidden by swirling mists. She was petite, with milk-white hair coiled into a loose bun and sharp eyes that belied her age. "Well, if it isn't Ethan Folkheimer," she said as they approached, her voice high and reedy. "Heard rumors you'd run afoul of Gareth Morvath." She paused to eye Lyra. "And you brought interesting company." Ethan leaned in, speaking in hushed tones. "We're looking for information on Astrian. The House of Lucier specifically. You hear anything?" A flicker of understanding crossed Relia's features. She measured Lyra with a single, penetrating glance, then waved them closer. "I've heard a whisper or two. Folks say there's a rebel movement, biding its time. They're rumored to be operating in the subterranean ruins of Astrian's old capital, forging alliances, waiting for the right moment to strike. But the new regime is harsh. If they catch even a hint of dissent, they strike like a star serpent." Lyra's eyes shone from under her hood. "In the rumor, do you know who leads these rebels? Do they remain loyal to the House of Lucia?" Relia peered at her more closely, then nodded to herself. "I suspect they do. Many Astrian citizens recall the old monarchy with fondness, though they might never say so openly. The question is, how can you approach them without alerting the regime?" Ethan drummed his fingers on the counter, considering. "We'll need a discreet landing. A contact on the ground who can guide us." Relia shrugged. "I might know a fellow who's made runs to Astrian's black market. Name's Joran Fleet. He's a pilot who smuggles contraband. He'd know how to slip past the patrols." Ethan nodded. "Where can we find him?" "In the southwestern quadrant, near Dock 7. He keeps to a dingy bar known as the Obsidian Key. But be warned, he's a cunning old coot. Not likely to help unless there's profit in it for him." That was standard in these parts. Ethan thanked Relia quietly and passed her a few more coins for her trouble. She smirked, pocketing them without a word. "Take care," she said. "You're stirring hornets' nests, my friend. Don't let them sting you dead." They left the tea house, the weight of their mission pressing more heavily on their shoulders than before. If indeed a rebel cell awaited them on Astrian, it might be Lyra's chance to reclaim her birthright, or at least ensure her safety. Yet each step toward Astrian increased the likelihood of confrontation with Morvath or, worse, the rulers who had dethroned her family. The Obsidian Key was as dismal as rumored, a cramped bar with flickering neon signage, scuffed metal tables, and the pervasive smell of stale liquor. A half-dozen patrons hunched over drinks, warily eyeing newcomers. In the far corner, a wiry man with unkempt gray hair and a sour expression nursed a tall glass of something noxious green. "Joran Fleet," Ethan announced, stepping up to the man's table. Joran's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" Ethan pulled out a chair, motioning Lyra to remain behind him. "A friend of Relia's. Word is you know how to slip onto Astrian unannounced. We need passage." A humorless snort escaped Joran's lips. "Astrian, is it? Dangerous place. Patrol ships, orbital cannons, loyalist crackdowns. What's your business there?" Ethan held his gaze. "Let's just say we're meeting old friends." Joran rubbed the stubble on his chin. "If you're forging a path to Astrian, you must be either insane or desperate." He looked past Ethan, eyes settling on Lyra's hooded figure. "Or both. What's under that hood? Something valuable, I suspect." Ethan felt anger flare but kept his voice even. "It's best you don't ask." The smuggler smirked. "Suit yourself. I can get you to Astrian, but it'll cost you. Risk fees, hazard pay, let's say 30,000 credits." Lyra stiffened at the enormous sum. Ethan snorted, crossing his arms. "We don't have that kind of currency on hand." "Then no deal," Joran shrugged, tipping his glass to his lips. Before Ethan could retort, Lyra stepped forward. She drew back her hood just enough for her violet features to glimmer in the bar's dim lights. The smuggler's eyes widened in surprise and recognition. "You're that missing princess," he breathed. A sly grin crept over his face. "Now that is interesting indeed. A pity you're not for sale, or I'd fetch a hefty sum from certain parties." Ethan's hand drifted to his sidearm. "Don't even think about it." But Joran raised both hands in mock surrender. "Relax, friend. I'm no fool. If the princess wants to return to Astrian, that's her business. But the risk is even greater than I thought. There's a massive bounty on her head. My new price is 40,000 credits." A hush fell. Ethan could almost taste his own fury, but another presence stilled him, Lyra's hand gently resting on his arm. The princess met Joran's gaze. "And what if, instead of money, I promised you something that surpasses credits?" she asked, voice calm. "If I succeed in uniting the rebels, if I reclaim my family's seat, I could reward you with a position of power, trade rights across the system, far more than your petty sum." Greed and curiosity flickered across Joran's expression. "That's a grand promise. Though from where I sit, it's just talk." Lyra stood taller. "My house's line spans centuries. Our resources once reached across entire sectors. Even if we cannot reclaim full power, we will hold enough influence to repay your loyalty tenfold." Her silver eyes glinted. "Assist us, and you will be remembered as the man who helped restore Astrian's rightful ruler." Ethan found himself momentarily entranced by the quiet authority in her tone. She might have lived as a fugitive, but her royal training shone through in moments like this. Joran mulled her words. His gaze flitted to Ethan, whose posture hinted that refusal could mean violence. At last, the smuggler sighed. "Very well. 40,000 or a future I can't yet see. I'll take a chance on your ambition." He sipped his drink. "I know an approach vector that avoids the main orbital scans. It'll get you planet-side undetected, if all goes smoothly." Ethan relaxed fractionally, though distrust still simmered. "We leave soon." "Tomorrow at dawn cycle," Joran replied, pushing away from the table. "I have a Corvette stashed in a private hangar. We'll slip past the blockade, land in the outskirts of the old capital. From there, you'll be on your own." Ethan nodded, though his gut churned with unease. They had little choice but to trust this mercenary. As Joran rose, he cast one more speculative glance at Lyra. Then he ambled off into the gloom of the bar, presumably to prepare for their mission. Lyra let out a breath. Ethan turned to her. "You sure about this? Joran's in it for himself, not your cause." Her lips thinned in determination. "We must risk it. There's too much at stake for me to hide forever. If I can rally those who still believe in the House of Lucier, perhaps we can bring justice to Astrian." He understood. In her eyes, he saw that unwavering sense of purpose he'd rarely encountered. He only hoped it would be enough to guide them through the perils they would face. True to his word, Joran guided them aboard his Corvette at the designated hour. Under the pretense of hauling industrial machinery, the ship's transponder broadcast a false ID, hopefully enough to fool the scanners orbiting Astrian. Ethan had stowed the Storm Wraith in a safe berth at the Port of Whispers, paying a shady mechanic to ensure no unauthorized tampering while they were gone. Lyra remained in a cramped cabin within Joran's vessel, her hood pulled low. Ethan stood on the bridge beside the smuggler, watching as Astrian's mottled green and blue surface came into view through the forward viewport. The planet looked peaceful from orbit, with swirling clouds drifting over vast oceans and sweeping continents. Yet Ethan knew the appearance was deceptive. Beneath that tranquil facade lurked a government that had seized power through bloodshed, an empire desperate to stamp out any threat to its dominion. The corvette's computer chirped. "Inbound traffic, identify yourself." A curt voice cracked through the comm. Joran answered smoothly. "This is the Wandering Sable, hauling industrial parts for the factories in Hellion City. We have clearance code T-774K. A brief pause. Then the orbital control responded, "Code verified. Proceed to designated landing zone." Joran winked at Ethan as he guided the ship into a descent vector. The corvette's hull rattled as it pushed through Astrian's atmosphere. Flames licked the edges of the viewport momentarily, then gave way to a brilliant, cloud-laden sky. "Now for the tricky part," the smuggler said, flipping a series of switches. "We're supposed to land in Hellion City, but I'll deviate course just enough to set us down near the old capital. That area's off-limits. We'll have only minutes before the local authorities realize something's amiss." Ethan steadied himself as the corvette banked sharply. Buildings and farmland came into focus, winding roads and scattered lights. In the distance, a crumbling skyline jutted up from a misty valley, remnants of Astrian's old capital, once the heart of the house of Lucier's empire. With a controlled thrust, Joran brought the vessel down in a half-collapsed courtyard. Vines and rubble choked what had once been an elegant plaza. Statues lay toppled, their faces weathered and unrecognizable. The corvette's landing struts groaned as they touched ancient cobblestones. "We're here," Joran announced, powering down the engines. He wiped sweat from his brow. "Now get off my ship before the patrols close in." Ethan and Lyra, along with a small pack of supplies, descended the loading ramp. The air smelled of damp stone and vegetation, reclaiming once grand avenues. Joran hovered by the ramp controls. "I'll circle back in 2 days. If you've found your rebels, good for you. If not," he shrugged, "try not to die." With that, he retracted the ramp. The corvette lifted off, stirring dust and leaves in its wake. Ethan raised an arm to shield his face, and then the ship was gone, leaving the pair alone in the silent ruin. Lyra pulled back her hood, gazing around with a mixture of reverence and sadness. "This was once the shining capital. My mother used to say it was the jewel of the galaxy." Her voice trembled. "Now it's a graveyard." Ethan gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let's move. If the rebels are here, we need to find them fast. And we need to avoid patrols." She nodded, steeling herself. "Follow me. There's a sub-level entrance to the old palace somewhere near the central plaza. If the rumors are true, the rebels might have established a hidden base there." They set off through streets choked with debris. The towering remnants of what had once been a grand palace loomed ahead, fractured windows glinting in the morning sun. A hush fell over everything, as though even the birds and insects dared not trespass on the haunted memory of this place. They walked for an hour, picking their way through half-collapsed corridors, stepping over broken statues of former monarchs. Lyra guided them deeper into the old palace grounds, halting once in a grand hall lined with shattered columns. Thin shafts of sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating swirling dust motes in the air. "Here," Lyra whispered, kneeling beside a cracked mosaic on the floor depicting the house of Lucier's crest, a stylized phoenix wreathed in silver flames. She brushed away rubble and found a discreet lever hidden beneath the broken tiles. With trembling hands, she pulled it. Stone ground on stone, and a section of the floor slid aside, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling into darkness. A faint draft of stale air rushed up to meet them. Without hesitation, Lyra led the way. Ethan followed, blaster drawn, footsteps echoing on moss-slick steps. Their descent ended in a silent corridor carved from living rock. Dim lights flickered along the walls, powered by some ancient generator that hummed in the distance. They passed chamber after chamber, each filled with relics of a bygone age, rusting suits of ceremonial armor, tattered banners bearing the phoenix symbol. Lyra's face grew tight with emotion, but she pressed on. At last, they reached a large antechamber. There, figures stepped from the shadows, weapon barrels flashing in the torchlight. Halt, a low voice commanded. Identify yourselves. Ethan raised his hands, though he kept his finger near the trigger. Lyra stepped forward, tugging back her hood once more. Her violet skin glowed in the weak light, and her silver eyes locked on the silhouette of a tall figure who appeared to lead these armed strangers. I am Lyra of the House of Lucier, she declared, voice echoing in the subterranean space. Daughter of King Torvith and Queen Eliana, I have come to seek those loyal to the crown. A stunned silence fell. Then a ripple of awe moved through the group. One of the figures, a woman with close-cropped hair, lowered her weapon, stepping closer. By the stars, I never thought I'd see the day. She studied Lyra intently. Princess Lyra? We feared you dead. Lyra lifted her chin. I survived, thanks to the courage of those who protected me. And I have returned to my home, though it lies in ruins, in hopes of restoring it. The tall leader, a grizzled man with a jagged scar across his cheek, strode forward. Prove you are who you claim, he demanded, though his voice wavered with subdued emotion. Lyra raised her hand to her chest, reciting a short oath in the formal Astrian dialect, an oath only the royal heirs would know. At her final word, the man's face softened. He bowed. Your Highness, his voice cracked. We have waited so long. Welcome to what remains of the Loyalist Guard. Weapons lowered around the room. An electric sense of hope coursed through the rebels, who gathered closer to see the princess they'd thought lost. Some bowed deeply. Others wore tearful smiles. Lyra's eyes shone. Friends, I have come to help however I can, but I am unprepared for the scale of the challenge before us. Tell me, how many stand with us? What resources do we have? The scarred man, whom the others called Commander Arvian, led them deeper into the hidden complex. We are but a fraction of what once was. Many were killed or fled to other worlds. But we remain resolute. Over the past years, we have built a network here. We sabotage the regime's supply lines, gather intelligence, and occasionally smuggle out those persecuted by the new government. Lyra squeezed Ethan's hand in quiet relief. Then we have a chance. Commander Arvian paused in a chamber lined with battered consoles and maps. He gestured to a large holographic projection of Astrian. The current regime calls itself the High Council, but it's little more than a dictatorship in all but name. They maintain control through fear and heavy taxation. We can't topple them alone. We need allies, weapons, the symbol that will rally the populace to resist. Lyra stepped closer to the hologram, her expression resolute. The symbol is here, the rightful heir returned. But that alone won't be enough. She looked back at Ethan. We need strategic allies, perhaps from outside Astrian, someone with a ship or resources. Ethan folded his arms. I can reach out to certain contacts, maybe pull some mercenaries to our side. But that'll draw attention, and we'll need credits. Arvian nodded. We have hidden caches of valuables. Some can be sold or traded. But time is short. The High Council is planning a new crackdown, rumored to be even more brutal than before. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. Then we move quickly, she declared. We strike when they least expect it, gather those who remain loyal, and show them the House of Lucier is not dead. A murmur of agreement swept through the rebels. Ethan couldn't help but notice the gleam of hope in their eyes, as if Lyra's presence alone had kindled a spark in hearts grown cold with despair. Over the next week, the underground chambers of the old palace bustled with activity unseen in years. Messengers came and went, bearing coded dispatches to far-flung settlements. Troops sparred with worn weapons, forging discipline out of desperation. Engineers tinkered with old technology, hoping to restore at least a fraction of the palace's defensive systems. Lyra threw herself into the effort. She spoke with every rebel she could, learning their stories of loss and hardship, offering words of encouragement. She attended strategy sessions with Commander Arvian, Ethan, and a handful of other loyalist officers. Though she had never fought a war herself, she brought a moral authority that solidified the rebels' resolve. Ethan, for his part, used his knowledge of guerrilla tactics. He taught the rebels how to set traps for patrols, how to scatter if discovered, how to use minimal weaponry to maximum effect. His mercenary past proved invaluable in planning for ambushes and infiltration. Despite his usual lone wolf nature, he found a sense of purpose in helping these people who dared to defy tyranny. Late one night, Ethan found Lyra alone in the old throne room, which had been largely destroyed. A single beam of moonlight pierced a gap in the ceiling, illuminating dust dancing in the air. She stood by the remains of the throne, a once majestic seat carved from white marble, now cracked and half-buried in rubble. He approached quietly. "You should rest. Tomorrow's infiltration mission is dangerous." She looked up, a sorrowful smile playing on her lips. "I know, but I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about my parents, how they sat on this throne and strove to be fair, just rulers. We were no strangers to political strife, but we never expected the Civil War to unfold so violently." Ethan laid a comforting hand on her shoulder. He saw tears glistening in her eyes. "They'd be proud of you," he said softly. "You've come back to defend your people." She drew in a shaky breath. "I often wonder if I'm strong enough. If I can lead these people as my parents once did." "You already are," Ethan assured her. In that moment, she turned and hugged him tightly, the weight of her emotions pressing against his chest. He hesitated, then gently wrapped his arms around her, letting her tears soak into his shirt. They stood like that for what felt like an eternity, the broken throne behind them a reminder of what was lost. Amidst the sorrow, Ethan felt a warmth bloom within him, an affection, even love, for this brave woman who, despite all she had endured, refused to give up. The next day, Ethan led a small team on a mission to Hellion City. Their objective was to steal medical supplies from a government depot, essential resources for the rebels. Lyra insisted on accompanying them, despite Commander Arvian's protests. She donned a cloak and hid her features, traveling under the guise of a commoner. They infiltrated Hellion City at dusk. Unlike the old capital, Hellion was modern, with high-rise buildings, neon signs, and heavily armed patrols at every corner. Under Ethan's guidance, the team slipped through side streets and alleys, carefully avoiding the watchful eyes of the regime's enforcers. Eventually, they reached the depot, a squat, fortified building bristling with surveillance cameras. A guard tower overlooked the courtyard, searchlights sweeping across the perimeter. "Disable the cameras, then we move in," Ethan whispered to the rebels. He pointed to a small control shed near the entrance. "We've got 3 minutes before the next patrol rounds the corner. Go." 2 rebels dashed forward, hugging the shadows. In moments, the lights on the cameras blinked out. Ethan led the rest of the team across the courtyard, where they forced open a side door with a silent electric pick. Inside, crates stacked to the ceiling held vials, bandages, and other medical essentials. Lyra helped load supplies on a hover sleds, adrenaline lending speed to her hands. In the distance, the clang of a door alerted them to approaching guards. "Hurry," Ethan hissed. "We've got incoming." A rebel slid the final crate onto a sled, and they began to withdraw. But as they reached the exit, a squad of armed enforcers rushed in, lasers at the ready. "Freeze," one shouted. "Drop your weapons." A fierce firefight erupted. Blaster bolts streaked across the storeroom. Ethan returned fire, taking down 2 enforcers. The rebels fanned out, exchanging deadly volleys. In the chaos, Lyra crouched behind a crate, heart pounding. This was not the refined warfare of court intrigue. This was brutal, immediate combat. Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. "Go," he roared over the din. The rebels dragged the hover sleds into the alley, firing behind them to keep the enforcers at bay. Sirens wailed, drawing more troops to the scene. They sprinted through the side streets, but a blockade of vehicles cut them off ahead. Another firefight ensued. Rebels ducked behind crates and abandoned cars, returning fire in frantic bursts. It was clear they were outnumbered. Lyra, chest heaving, watched as one rebel was shot down beside her. She bit back a cry, fear warring with anger. Next to her, Ethan's jaw was set in grim determination. "They're closing in," he muttered. "We need a diversion." Before anyone could respond, a roar of engines thundered from the next street over. A battered speeder truck careened around the corner, smashing into the blockade. Its driver, a rebel operative, waved them aboard. "Move, move." Seizing the moment, the team lunged forward, dragging the hover sleds. Blaster fire scorched the air, but the truck's heavy armor shielded them long enough to scramble onto the cargo bed. The driver floored it, engines screaming, leaving behind a trail of sparks and battered enforcers. They hurtled through the city's outskirts, narrowly dodging pursuit vehicles. At one point, they plunged into a slum district, weaving between ramshackle tenements. Eventually, the enforcers fell behind, thwarted by the maze of alleys. By dawn, they reached a hidden tunnel entrance used by the rebels, slipping underground. Exhausted and shaken, they emerged in the old palace sublevel, greeted by anxious loyalists who rushed to offload the precious medical supplies. Commander Arvian was waiting, relief etched on his scarred face. "We thought you'd been caught," he said. "Well done." Lyra sank to her knees, trembling from the aftershock of violence. Ethan knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her back. Slowly, she raised her gaze, her expression a mix of horror and resolve. Yes, war was ugly, but these supplies would save countless lives. This was the price of rebellion. In the weeks that followed, raids continued. Each success emboldened the rebels, and word spread quietly through Astrian's underbelly that the Princess of Lucio had returned. Though the new regime cracked down ferociously, the rebels proved elusive, striking supply lines and melting away into hidden strongholds. Ethan and Lyra spent long days strategizing, training recruits, and negotiating with potential allies. Despite the exhaustion and the danger, a sense of camaraderie thrived among the rebels, and with it, a deepening bond between Ethan and Lyra. One evening, after a fierce skirmish on the outskirts of Hellion City, Ethan returned to the old palace with a bleeding wound across his side. Lyra rushed to his aid, pressing a cloth to stanch the blood. Anguish lined her features as she knelt by him in a dim corridor. "You're hurt again," she whispered. "Just a scratch," he gritted, though the wound stung fiercely. She helped into a makeshift infirmary where a medic began cleaning the gash. Lyra hovered, concern etched on her face. Once the medic finished, Ethan insisted on walking to his quarters under his own power, albeit shakily. Inside his dimly lit room, he sank onto a wooden bench. Lyra followed, arms folded as if hugging herself. The flickering glow of a battered lantern cast shadows across the stone walls. "You take too many risks," she said, voice trembling with restrained emotion. "If something happened to you." He looked up, brow creasing. "I'm a soldier. Risks come with the job." She shook her head. "Not anymore. You're more than just a hired gun. You're part of this cause, part of us." Her voice dropped. "Part of me." Time seemed to suspend. He stood, gingerly, ignoring the flare of pain in his side. "Lyra." Before he could utter another word, she closed the distance and wrapped her arms around him. Their lips met in a tender, desperate kiss, born of the fear of losing each other in the chaos of war. For a heartbeat, everything else fell away, the danger, the crumbling walls, the entire galaxy. There was only the two of them. When they finally broke apart, her silver eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Don't leave me," she whispered. He pressed a hand gently against her cheek. "I'm not going anywhere." In that quiet moment, love found a foothold amidst the rubble of a ruined palace. Though the future was uncertain, they held to each other, determined to forge a path through the darkness together. News of the rebels' growing strength eventually reached the ears of the High Council. In response, the regime deployed a massive crackdown. Enforcer patrols swept through villages, rounding up suspects. Caches of weapons were seized, and harsh punishments were doled out to deter further dissent. Commander Arvian received word that a large force was converging on the old capital. The rebels readied themselves for a desperate stand in the palace ruins. To avoid total destruction, Ethan and Lyra decided to evacuate the injured and non-combatants into the deeper sublevels. A skeleton crew of fighters would remain, hoping to delay the enemy. The day dawned gray and cold. As the sun rose over the crumbling battlements, hundreds of enforcers, flanked by heavy tanks and gunships, rolled into the ancient city. The rebels took position among the ruins, blasters aimed, hearts pounding. A thunderous battle erupted. Laser fire streaked across the broken plazas. Tanks rumbled over collapsed columns, shells bursting against the palace walls. From hidden vantage points, the rebels unleashed sniper fire and rocket volleys, toppling some of the regime's vehicles. But the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. Smoke choked the air, and screams echoed through the corridors. Lyra stood beside Ethan, vantage point on a collapsed tower. She fired a borrowed rifle at advancing troops, each shot guided by determination. Ethan hurled grenades to slow the onslaught. Around them, rubble crumbled, and the tower shook under heavy bombardment. When a barrage struck the tower's base, the floor lurched beneath them. Ethan yanked Lyra away from a collapsing wall just in time. They slid down a pile of debris, bruised but alive. All around, the palace trembled as centuries-old architecture gave way. Commander Arvian's voice crackled through a communicator. "Retreat. We can't hold them much longer." Fall back to the sub-levels. The rebels pulled back. Soldiers carried their wounded, stumbling through corridors thick with dust and ash. Smoke stung Lyra's eyes, tears running down her cheeks. The city she had loved was now a battlefield, and the monarchy's final stronghold teetered on the brink of destruction. As they reached the sub-level entrance, Ethan helped slam the heavy stone door behind them. Explosions rumbled overhead, and the subterranean passages shook with each impact. Arvian faced them, grimly. We'll seal ourselves in for now, but they'll eventually break through or starve us out. We must find another way. Lyra, voice hoarse, spoke up. We can't defeat them through brute force. We need a plan, something to strike at the heart of the regime. If we could topple their leadership, the rest might crumble. Ethan nodded, wiping sweat and grime from his brow. A decapitation strike. If we can find a way to infiltrate the High Council itself. Arvian set his jaw. We have intelligence on their main fortress in Hellion. It's heavily guarded, but if we get inside, we could disable their command center, force a surrender. Lyra's expression hardened. Then that's our next move. Amid the ruins, the rebels regrouped. Despite the losses and battered spirits, they rallied behind the princess's determination. Within hours, the survivors prepared for a stealth incursion, uncertain if it would be their salvation or their doom. Before they departed on the desperate mission, Lyra began to experience bouts of nausea and dizziness. At first, she attributed it to exhaustion and stress. But as days passed, a different suspicion formed in her mind. She confided in a rebel medic who performed a simple test in a cramped subterranean alcove. To Lyra's disbelief, the medic confirmed she was with child. Shock mingled with wonder as she realized the life growing inside her, a symbol of her bond with Ethan, and perhaps a harbinger of Astrian's future. She found Ethan alone, rummaging for supplies. Quietly, she placed a trembling hand on his arm. Ethan, we're going to have a child. His reaction was first stunned silence, then an overwhelming tide of emotion. He cradled her face, eyes searching hers. Are you sure? She nodded, tears slipping free. I didn't plan for this, not in the midst of war. But it's real. He pulled her close, pressing his lips to her forehead. Warmth flooded him, along with a fierce protective instinct. Then everything we do now, it's for our child, too. They stood together in that dim corridor, hearts brimming with a cautious joy. While the world outside crumbled, they had found a reason to hope, to fight all the harder. Their child would be half human, half Astrian, a living bridge between two worlds. Word spread quietly among the rebels, who took the news as an omen. The house of Lucio would endure, and in that unborn child, they saw a future that might unite Astrian once more. With morale bolstered, the rebels launched their final gambit. Under the cloak of night, they infiltrated Hellion City in scattered groups, each slipping past checkpoints using forged credentials or stealth. Their objective, the High Council's fortress, a monolithic structure walled by thick durasteel, with guard towers bristling with weaponry. Ethan and Lyra led the main strike team. Commander Arvian coordinated infiltration from a distant vantage. Step by step, the rebels neutralized guard posts and slipped into maintenance corridors. Alarms blared as the fortress scrambled to respond, but the rebels used cunning and sabotage to stay one step ahead. In the heart of the fortress lay the council chamber, an opulent hall with marble floors and towering pillars. The counselors, robed in dark finery, cowered behind an elite guard as the rebels burst through heavy doors in a hail of blaster fire. The archaic pomp of the chamber contrasted with the modern brutality of the clash. Ethan charged forward, exchanging deadly shots with the elite guards. Lyra, flanked by loyalist soldiers, confronted the counselors themselves. She tore back her hood, revealing her violet countenance. I am Lyra of Lucier, she declared, voice resonating over the gunfire. Your illegitimate rule ends now. A counselor sneered. You're a relic of the past. We rule by might. They unleashed a volley of blaster fire, but the rebels returned it in kind. The air crackled with energy bolts. Sparks rained from shattered chandeliers. And then, in a final, desperate push, the rebels subdued the last of the elite guards. Lyra stood before the counselors, who shrank back in terror. Ethan caught up to her, breath ragged, blood trickling from a graze on his shoulder. Around them, rebels secured the chamber, rounding up the counselors. Commander Arvian strode in, eyes wide with the realization that the fortress had fallen. We did it, he whispered. A hush settled as Lyra stepped onto the dais where the counselors had once presided. She looked down at them, battered yet resolute. Astrian deserves better than tyrants who seized power by force. She turned to the rebels. We shall not become what we despise. They will stand trial for their crimes. A roar of approval burst from the rebels. In that triumphant moment, centuries of royal tradition intertwined with the pragmatic hope of the insurgents. Astrian's future, once so uncertain, now glimmered with promise. The days and weeks after the fortress's fall were a flurry of reconstruction. The old monarchy was formally restored in a ceremony blending ancient rites with modern reforms. Lyra, the last surviving member of the House of Lucere, was proclaimed Queen of Astrian. Yet she refused to rule as an absolute monarch, instead establishing a constitution that balanced the monarchy's ceremonial role with democratic governance. Across Astrian, the populace celebrated the end of oppressive rule. The battered old capital was designated for restoration, while Hellion City's bureaucratic structures were reformed. The rebels, now recognized as freedom fighters, were lauded as heroes, and their ranks helped maintain order during the transition. Through it all, Ethan remained by Lyra's side, both as her protector and her beloved. Their child grew within her, a symbol that transcended species or birthright. It was said throughout Astrian that the child would unite the best of both worlds, human grit and Astrian nobility. A year passed, and in the newly rebuilt royal palace, though still modest by ancient standards, joyous cries echoed through the corridors as Lyra gave birth to a daughter. The baby's skin held a soft lavender hue, her eyes a vivid silver tinted with flecks of green. When Ethan cradled her in his arms, tears of awe filled his eyes. They named her Althea, which in the old Astrian tongue meant hope reborn. That day, the entire planet rejoiced, for in the eyes of many, Althea symbolized a new era, one forged from the ashes of oppression and guided by love that defied boundaries of species and tradition. Ethan, once a wandering mercenary haunted by war, now found peace and purpose in fatherhood. Lyra, a princess turned queen, found the strength to guide her people into a future of fairness and unity. And little Althea, her laughter echoing through sunlit corridors, became the nexus of their shared destiny. Under a sapphire sky dotted with drifting clouds, Ethan walked across the palace courtyard, holding Althea's tiny hand as she wobbled on unsteady legs. Lyra trailed close behind, wearing a simple gown befitting a modern queen, regal, yet approachable. Sunlight glinted off newly restored walls, and the flags of the House of Lucere fluttered in a gentle breeze. Astrian was healing, though scars of war remained. Villages rebuilt, farmland blossomed once more, and trade routes opened to other worlds. Refugees returned, bringing stories of hardship and hope. Pausing at the courtyard center, Ethan lifted Althea into his arms, gazing at her with unspoken wonder. Lyra stepped forward, resting a hand on his shoulder. For a moment, they stood in perfect harmony, a family forged by chance and bound by love, their hearts beating in time with the newfound peace of an entire planet. Far away, no doubt, dangers still lurked, remnants of the old regime, and scrupulous warlords, and opportunists who would test the new queen's resolve. But for now, in the hush of a sunlit afternoon, there was only quiet contentment, a sense that, though the galaxy might be vast and perilous, love and hope could prevail even in the darkest corners. Thus did the runaway princess, once sold as a mere commodity, reclaim her birthright and transform her world. And the mercenary who accepted her as payment found a treasure beyond all measure, a home, a family, and a legacy to guide the stars. And so their story ended, happily, in a dawn of promise for Astrian and the child who would guide its future.